I used to believe respect disappeared slowly. I was wrong. Sometimes it vanishes in a single sentence spoken across a polished conference table while everyone else pretends not to notice. The boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago had floor-to-ceiling windows, polished walnut walls, and a view of Lake Michigan that most executives would envy. Bennett Industries had gathered every senior executive, board member, outside consultant, and lending partner for what my father-in-law called the most important meeting in the company's history. Their manufacturing business had spent nearly 80 years supplying industrial equipment across the Midwest, but declining sales, rising debt, and several expensive acquisitions had pushed them dangerously close to a financial crisis. Everyone in the room knew salvation depended on one thing: a $200 million strategic bailout from an investment fund scheduled to finalize its decision within days. My name is Nathan Walker. I married Victoria Bennett 11 years earlier after we met during a leadership conference in Boston. She was intelligent, ambitious, and endlessly optimistic about the future. I admired how fiercely she believed in her family's business. When we married, I promised myself I would always support her dreams, even if it meant quietly standing in the background while the Bennett family remained in the spotlight. Looking back, I realized there is a difference between supporting someone and slowly disappearing inside their expectations. Charles Bennett stood at the front of the conference room, reviewing financial projections displayed across a massive screen. His voice remained steady, but I noticed the tension hidden beneath every sentence. Diane Bennett sat beside him organizing binders while Ryan Bennett casually leaned back in his chair, checking messages on his phone as though the company were discussing quarterly sales instead of its future. Victoria sat beside me wearing the same composed expression she always carried during board meetings. She reached beneath the table and briefly squeezed my hand. For a moment, I believed everything would be all right. Then Charles closed the presentation, looked directly toward me, and calmly said the words that changed everything. Before we continue discussing confidential matters, there is one issue we need to resolve. The room became noticeably quieter. He folded his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the table. Nathan, he continued, after careful discussion, our family has decided you are no longer part of the Bennett family. You are not our son-in-law, and from this moment forward you will not participate in decisions involving this company. No one gasped. No one objected. The silence hurt far more than raised voices ever could have. I slowly turned toward Victoria, waiting for her to say something. Anything. Instead, she lowered her eyes toward the financial reports resting in front of her. She never defended me. She never questioned her father's decision. Her silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt long enough to erase 11 years of marriage. Ryan smiled faintly without looking up from his phone. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to study documents that no one was actually reading anymore. I stood without saying a word. There was nothing left to argue. Respect cannot be negotiated once someone has publicly decided you no longer deserve it. I collected my notebook, thanked everyone for their time, and quietly walked toward the conference room door. Just before leaving, I paused long enough to look back one final time. Every person in that room believed I was walking away because I had just lost my place in their family. None of them realized they were watching the only person who could decide whether Bennett Industries would still exist by the end of the month. And they were only days away from asking for a signature they had just convinced themselves no longer mattered. I walked out of Bennett Industries without looking back, but the silence inside the elevator stayed with me all the way to the parking garage beneath the building. The polished steel doors reflected a man I barely recognized. My suit was the same one I had worn to dozens of board meetings over the years. My wedding ring still rested on my left hand. Yet somehow, according to the people I had spent more than a decade calling family, I no longer belonged. Outside, a cold Chicago wind swept through the streets while late afternoon traffic crawled toward the expressway. I sat inside my truck for several minutes without starting the engine. My phone remained completely silent. No message from Charles. No apology from Diane. Most of all, no call from Victoria. Looking back, I think that silence hurt more than anything spoken inside the boardroom. Victoria and I met 11 years earlier during a business leadership conference in Boston. She had just finished presenting a case study on family-owned manufacturing companies adapting to international competition. I challenged one of her conclusions during the question and answer session, and instead of becoming offended, She invited me to continue the conversation over coffee. We spent nearly 3 hours talking about business, family, and the future we hoped to build someday. She told me Bennett Industries meant everything to her because her grandfather had started the company in a small warehouse after returning from military service. I admired that loyalty. It reminded me of my own father, who always believed businesses existed to serve communities before they served shareholders. After we married, I never asked for a title inside Bennett Industries. Charles eventually invited me to join strategic planning meetings because I had spent years working in corporate finance and restructuring large manufacturing companies. Whenever the business faced difficult decisions, I quietly prepared reports, analyzed debt structures, negotiated with lenders, and suggested long-term solutions. Most recommendations were presented publicly under Charles's name. That never bothered me. Success does not always require recognition. Sometimes helping the people you love feels rewarding enough. Over time, however, I noticed something changing inside the Bennett family. Good results were celebrated as family victories. Difficult decisions quietly became my responsibility behind closed doors. Ryan often joked that I was the unofficial cleanup crew because I always seemed to appear whenever numbers stopped making sense. Everyone laughed. I usually laughed with them. Looking back, humor has an incredible way of hiding disrespect before anyone notices it becoming permanent. Victoria saw many of those moments, but she rarely challenged them. Whenever I mentioned feeling uncomfortable, she gently reminded me that her father had always been demanding and that Ryan simply lacked maturity. "Do not take it personally," she often said. "That is just how my family communicates." I wanted to believe her because marriage requires trust. So I kept helping. I continued reviewing financing proposals late into the night. I attended emergency meetings on weekends. I quietly introduced Charles to banking relationships that eventually kept the company operating during several difficult years. None of those contributions appeared in annual reports or company newsletters, and I never expected them to. I believe loyalty was measured by actions, not applause. What I failed to recognize was that the Bennett family had slowly begun viewing my loyalty as something they automatically deserved instead of something they should appreciate. Sitting alone in the parking garage that afternoon, I finally understood the difference. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated for the first time all day. The message came from someone whose name had not appeared on my screen in nearly 6 months. Daniel Foster. His text contained only one sentence. "The investment committee wants to schedule the final authorization meeting tomorrow morning." At that moment, I realized the meeting I had just left was not the only decision that would determine Bennett Industries' future. I did not answer Daniel's message immediately. Instead, I drove north along Lakeshore Drive with the skyline fading behind me while the sun disappeared beneath a layer of gray clouds stretching across Lake Michigan. Chicago looked exactly as it always had, busy and confident, completely unaware that one sentence spoken inside a boardroom had quietly changed the direction of my life. By the time I reached home, the lights inside the house were already on. Victoria's car was parked in the driveway. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe she had come home early because she regretted what happened. Hope has a remarkable ability to survive long after logic has surrendered. She was sitting at the kitchen island when I walked inside, still wearing the same navy business suit from the meeting. 2 untouched cups of coffee rested between us. She looked exhausted rather than angry. "We need to talk," she said softly. I nodded and took the chair across from her. Several seconds passed before either of us spoke again. Finally, she lowered her eyes toward the countertop. "My father believes it would be better if you stayed away from the company for a while." I studied her face carefully, waiting for the rest of the sentence. "Do you believe that too?" I asked quietly. She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without actually saying the word yes. "Everything is complicated right now," she whispered. "The company is under enormous pressure." I leaned back in my chair. I did not ask about the company. I asked about us. She remained silent. That silence became the answer I had been trying to avoid since leaving the boardroom. Looking back, marriages rarely collapse because of one dramatic moment. They slowly weaken every time someone chooses comfort over courage. During the months leading to that meeting, I had noticed small changes that seemed insignificant at the time. Family dinners increasingly became discussions about preserving the Bennett legacy. Ryan openly joked that outsiders could never truly understand what it meant to protect a family business. Charles stopped asking for my opinion during executive meetings, even though he continued using many of the financial strategies I had quietly prepared beforehand. Diane gradually introduced me as Victoria's husband instead of calling me part of the family. Each change appeared small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to acknowledge. Victoria reached across the kitchen island and gently touched my hand. "Please do not make this harder than it already is." I looked at her with genuine sadness rather than anger. "Victoria," I said quietly, "your father publicly told an entire boardroom that I am no longer his son-in-law. You sat beside me and never said a single word." Tears slowly filled her eyes, but she still offered no explanation. Instead, she stood, walked upstairs, and closed the bedroom door without another sentence. I remained alone in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the background while the untouched coffee slowly grew cold. Around 9 that evening, my phone vibrated again. Daniel Foster. This time I answered. "Tomorrow's authorization meeting has been moved forward," he said calmly. "The investment committee wants every principal decision-maker present." I stared through the kitchen window toward the dark street outside. "Has Bennett Industries submitted the final bailout request?" Daniel paused briefly before replying. "Yes. They believe approval is now only a formality." I quietly thanked him and ended the call. What the Bennett family did not know was that the $200 million rescue package they had already begun celebrating depended upon one final signature. They assumed it belonged to someone they had never met. They had no idea they had spent the entire day pushing that person out of their lives. The following morning began long before sunrise. I arrived at Daniel Foster's office on the 32nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Chicago River while most of the city was still waking up. The conference room lights reflected across the water below as commuters slowly filled the streets. Daniel was already waiting beside a polished oak table covered with legal folders, financial models, and one thick binder marked with the name of the investment fund Bennett Industries had spent months trying to secure. He stood as I entered and quietly poured 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you did not sleep," he said. I smiled faintly. "I did not." He nodded as though he expected that answer. Daniel and I had known each other for nearly 15 years. We first met while restructuring a manufacturing company after the financial crisis. Since then, he had represented several investment partnerships I quietly advised, though almost no one outside those circles knew the extent of my involvement. Confidentiality had always mattered more than publicity. Daniel opened the binder to the final approval schedule. "Bennett Industries officially submitted every required document yesterday afternoon," he explained. "The lenders are prepared. The board has already voted. Everyone believes funding will be released immediately after the final authorization." I studied the numbers carefully. Revenue projections, debt maturities, cash flow assumptions. Everything matched the reports I had privately reviewed over previous months. The company was no longer approaching financial distress. It had already reached it. Without immediate funding, several loan covenants would be breached within weeks. Suppliers would tighten credit. Expansion projects would stop. Confidence inside the banking community would begin disappearing almost overnight. Looking back, the bailout was never about growth. It was about survival. Daniel slid another folder toward me. "There is something else you should review." Inside were copies of correspondence exchanged between Bennett Industries and the investment committee. Charles repeatedly thanked the committee for believing in the company's future. Ryan confidently discussed expansion plans once financing arrived. Reading those letters felt strangely distant, almost as though they had been written to someone else. None of them mentioned me. None of them acknowledged the countless late nights I had spent helping stabilize the company long before this crisis reached public view. Daniel watched me quietly before speaking again. "Nathan, there is still time to approve everything exactly as planned." I closed the folder without answering immediately. "What happens if I decline?" I finally asked. Daniel remained completely professional. "The committee cannot proceed without unanimous authorization from every managing principal." He paused briefly before continuing. "And you remain the final managing principal." I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the skyline stretching across downtown Chicago. Years earlier, several institutional investors asked me to help establish an independent strategic investment fund focused on preserving American manufacturing businesses. During periods of financial instability, I agreed only under one condition. Every investment decision required unanimous approval, so no individual could be pressured into financing companies that ignored responsible leadership. Most people assumed I served only as an outside advisor. Very few knew I was one of the original founding partners whose signature remained mandatory for transactions above $100 million. Bennett Industries never learned that detail because they never asked. They simply assumed money appeared wherever influence existed. Daniel carefully closed the final binder before sliding one single page toward me. At the bottom rested an empty signature line. Nothing had been approved yet. Nothing had been rejected either. One decision still separated Bennett Industries from $200 million. As I stared at the blank page, my phone vibrated softly against the conference table. The caller identification displayed Victoria's name. It was the first time she had tried to reach me since her father publicly announced I was no longer part of their family. I watched Victoria's name remain on my phone screen until the call ended on its own. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Please talk to me before you make any decisions. I stared at those words longer than I expected. She still did not know where I was or why I had been invited to Daniel's office that morning. She assumed I was simply hurt by what happened at Bennett Industries. She had no reason to imagine I was now sitting less than 10 feet away from the documents that would determine whether her family's company survived the coming month. Daniel remained silent, giving me space to think. He had always understood that the most important business decisions were rarely financial. They were personal. After several quiet moments, I finally placed my phone face down on the conference table without replying. You already know what I am going to ask, Daniel said calmly. I nodded. I want to understand everything one last time. He opened another section of the binder containing the original formation documents for the investment partnership. 15 years earlier, 5 institutional investors created the Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund to prevent strong American manufacturing companies from collapsing because of temporary financial crises. I joined as one of the founding managing principals after helping develop its long-term investment strategy. My condition had been simple. Every rescue package above $100 million required unanimous approval from every managing principal. You insisted on that provision yourself, Daniel reminded me. You said no executive team should ever assume rescue money belongs to them simply because they expect it. I smiled quietly. I remember. At the time, I believed accountability protected both investors and businesses. Looking back, I never imagined that principle would one day protect me. Daniel continued reviewing the Bennett transaction. The committee had completed month. That afternoon, Bennett Industries scheduled what Charles proudly described as the final coordination meeting before the rescue capital arrived. Every executive, department head, outside banking representative, and legal advisor gathered inside the same boardroom where I had quietly walked away less than 24 hours earlier. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Confidence had returned. Financial charts displayed projected expansion plans instead of emergency cash flow reports. Ryan laughed with several executives near the windows while discussing future acquisitions as though the company's recovery had already become official. Charles welcomed everyone with the calm confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of the journey was finally behind him. Once the Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund completes its final authorization today, he announced, Bennett Industries will enter the strongest chapter in our company's history. Applause filled the room. Listening through the secure conference line from Daniel's office, I realized no one questioned whether approval would actually happen. They had already convinced themselves success was guaranteed. Hope can be inspiring, but entitlement often disguises itself as certainty. Daniel quietly muted the audio feed before looking toward me. The committee has agreed to one final procedural meeting, he explained. They want both parties present before the authorization becomes legally effective. About 30 minutes later, Daniel and I entered Bennett Industries together. Several employees greeted him respectfully before noticing me walking beside him. Confused expressions quickly spread across the lobby. Word traveled through the building much faster than either of us expected. By the time the elevator reached the executive floor, nearly everyone seemed to know I had returned. When the boardroom doors opened, every conversation stopped instantly. Charles looked genuinely surprised to see Daniel first, then me. Nathan, he said carefully, this meeting is reserved for company representatives. Daniel calmly handed his business card to the corporate attorney seated beside Charles. Daniel Foster, senior counsel for the Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund. The attorney immediately recognized the name and stood to shake his hand. A noticeable shift passed through the room. Charles frowned slightly. We were expecting representatives from the fund this afternoon. Daniel smiled politely. You were looking at them. Ryan glanced toward me with obvious confusion before quietly asking, why is Nathan here? Daniel waited until everyone had taken their seats before placing a thick binder on the conference table. Before any funding can be authorized, he began. Our committee requested clarification regarding certain governance matters that occurred during yesterday's board meeting. Charles exchanged a brief glance with Diane. I'm not sure I understand. Daniel opened the binder to a certified memorandum and slid copies toward every director. Yesterday, Mr. Nathan Walker was formally informed that he was no longer considered part of the Bennett family and was excluded from further participation in company affairs. Is that an accurate description of what occurred? The room became noticeably quieter. Charles answered without hesitation. Yes, that was a private family decision. Daniel nodded respectfully. Thank you. That confirmation is important. Victoria looked from Daniel to me, then back toward her father. I could see uncertainty growing across her face as she slowly realized this meeting had nothing to do with ordinary legal paperwork. Charles leaned forward. What possible relevance could that have to our financing? Daniel closed the binder and folded his hands. Every relevance, he answered calmly. Because the Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund requires unanimous authorization from all managing principals before any investment exceeding $100 million can be released. He turned toward me before speaking the next sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to formally introduce one of the founding managing principals of the Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund, Mr. Nathan Walker. Around the table, expressions shifted from confidence to disbelief in complete silence. For the second time in 2 days, no one knew what to say. The difference was that this time, everyone suddenly understood exactly whose decision would determine the future of Bennett Industries. Nearly 18 months passed before I stood once again in a boardroom overlooking the Chicago skyline. This time, the room belonged to a different company. The long walnut table was surrounded by founders of small manufacturing businesses from across the Midwest, men and women trying to preserve companies their families had spent generations building. They were not asking for guarantees. They were asking for a fair opportunity. Looking around the room, I quietly remembered the day I walked out of Bennett Industries believing I had lost everything that mattered. Looking back now, I understand I had actually walked toward the life I was meant to build. The Strategic Manufacturing Recovery Fund continued investing in businesses that demonstrated responsible leadership, transparent governance, and genuine respect for their employees. We declined opportunities that relied on arrogance rather than accountability, regardless of how profitable they appeared on paper. The investment committee often reminded new applicants that financial statements reveal numbers, but leadership reveals character. Over time, those words became the guiding principle behind every decision we made. Bennett Industries slowly stabilized through disciplined restructuring and patient leadership. The company became smaller than before, but healthier. Charles fulfilled every commitment outlined in his recovery plan. He focused less on rapid expansion and more on rebuilding trust with employees, suppliers, and lenders. Daniel occasionally shared public updates with me, though I never asked for details beyond what was necessary. Some chapters of life deserve distance if they are ever going to heal. Victoria and I eventually met one final time at a quiet lakeside cafe near downtown Chicago. There were no lawyers, no board members, and no financial documents waiting on the table between us. Only two people reflecting on the choices that had changed both of their lives. She smiled gently as she stirred her coffee. I spent years believing loyalty meant standing beside my family no matter what, she said softly. Now I understand loyalty without courage eventually becomes silence. I nodded because I had learned something equally important. Love cannot survive where respect is treated as optional, I answered. Neither of us argued. Neither of us searched for someone else to blame. Some conversations do not exist to repair the past. They exist so both people can carry better wisdom into the future. When we left the cafe, we wished each other genuine happiness before walking in different directions. There was sadness, but there was also peace. That surprised me more than anything else. A few months later, I received an invitation to speak at a national manufacturing leadership conference. The organizers asked me to discuss governance, long-term investment, and responsible leadership. Near the end of my presentation, one young entrepreneur stood and asked a simple question. What is the most valuable asset a company can protect? The audience expected me to answer with capital, technology, or intellectual property. Instead, I smiled and replied, respect. Every successful partnership is built on trust, and trust cannot survive where respect disappears. Once people stop valuing one another, every contract eventually becomes weaker than the relationship holding it. Together, the room remained completely silent before applause slowly filled the auditorium. As I drove home that evening, the city lights reflected across Lake Michigan much like they had on the day everything first began to unravel. The difference was no longer outside my window. It was inside me. Wealth can be earned. Businesses can be rebuilt. Opportunities can return after failure. But the people who truly enrich your life are the ones who choose to stand beside you when doing so costs them something. I once believed losing my place inside one family meant losing my future. I know now that the greatest opportunities often begin the moment someone else underestimates your worth. Because titles may be taken away, boardroom seats may become empty, and fortunes may rise or fall, but a person who refuses to compromise integrity will always possess something far more valuable than money. They will possess a reputation that no one else has the power to cancel.